Part 1. The festival had existed for 12,000 years. In all that time, the organizing committee had never recorded a single death. They were very proud of this fact. They mentioned it in every advertisement, every invitation, and every speech. The festival was beautiful and completely safe. Everyone knew this. Beings from across the galaxy traveled to watch the show. The sun was dying, but it was dying slowly and beautifully. Every year, the star released massive bursts of energy that painted the void in colors that no single species could fully see. The organizers built floating platforms that drifted millions of kilometers from the star. Guests stood on these platforms and watched the light show while eating expensive food and making important business connections. The platforms used anti-gravity technology that was older than most civilizations. They had worked perfectly for thousands of years. No one had ever questioned their design. Then humanity received its first invitation. Commissioner Han was a tall being with blue skin and 7 eyes. She had run the Universal Festival Authority for 300 years. In that time, she had overseen thousands of events across hundreds of worlds. She had never encountered a problem she could not solve with patience and careful diplomacy. She had certainly never encountered humans before. The human delegation arrived on the morning of the festival. There were about 50 of them, representing various nations and organizations from there. They seemed friendly enough. They smiled a lot and asked many questions. Han assigned a junior official to show them around and forgot about them. This was a mistake. 6 hours later, an ambassador almost died. The species were known for their love of documentation. Ambassador had attended the festival many times before. He enjoyed taking photographs of the stellar displays to show his family back home. This year, he had learned about a human invention called the selfie. He wanted to try it. He stood on the edge of a floating platform. He turned his back to the dying star. He held up his recording device and smiled with all 3 of his mouths. He took 1 step backward to get a better angle. There was nothing behind him but empty space. A human child grabbed him before he fell. Her name was Sophie and she was 8 years old. She had been standing nearby with her parents, watching the light show. When she saw the ambassador step backward toward the edge, she did not think. She simply moved. Her small hands closed around his thorax and she pulled with all her strength. The ambassador was much larger than her. He outweighed her by at least 200 kilograms. But Sophie had the advantage of surprise and very determined grip. She stopped him just long enough for her father to help pull him back to safety. Ambassador sat on the platform floor for a long time. His 3 hearts were beating very fast. He looked at the edge of the platform, where there was nothing at all to stop someone from stepping into the void. Then he looked at the human child who had saved his life. "Thank you," he said. Sophie looked at him with the particular expression that human children use when they think adults are being stupid. "Why don't you have a fence?" she asked. The ambassador did not have an answer. Within the hour, the human delegation had identified 17 major safety concerns. They wrote them all down and presented them to Commissioner Han in a formal report. The commissioner read the report with growing horror. The anti-gravity platforms had no railings, edges, or barriers of any kind. The emergency teleportation beacons required users to enter a calm, meditative state before activation, which meant they were useless during an actual emergency. The traditional fire wine was served in containers that looked almost exactly like the cleaning solvents used to maintain the platforms. The viewing areas had no designated walkways, so guests wandered wherever they wanted, often into areas that received dangerous levels of radiation. The food preparation areas had no separation between ingredients that were nutritious for some species and poisonous to others. "How," Han demanded of her assistant, "has no one ever died here?" Her assistant was a methane-breathing being from the outer systems. He had worked for the UFA for 50 years and had never seen the commissioner this upset. He consulted his records carefully before answering. "It appears, Commissioner, that most species simply do not move backward without looking. The ambassador was attempting a selfie, which is a human invention. Before humans arrived, no one had ever done such a thing near the platform edges. And the cleaning solvent containers. Most species can easily distinguish them by smell. Humans apparently cannot. And the meditation-based emergency beacons. Most species naturally enter calm states when faced with danger. Humans apparently do the opposite." Han set down the report. She looked at her assistant with all 7 of her eyes. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that this festival has been safe for 12,000 years only because no one ever attended who was anything like a human?" Her assistant thought about this for a moment. "Yes, Commissioner, that appears to be the case." Han called an emergency meeting. The meeting room was large enough to hold representatives from dozens of species. Han filled it with everyone she could find on short notice. She stood at the front and explained the situation. She showed them the human safety report. She described the near death of Ambassador. She asked for their thoughts. The initial response was confusion. "I do not understand," said a crystalline being whose name could only be pronounced as a series of harmonic tones. "The platforms have always been this way. Why would we change them now?" "Because someone almost died," Han said. "Almost," the crystalline being repeated, "but did not. The record remains unbroken." "Only because a human child happened to be standing nearby." "Then it seems humans are useful. Perhaps we should station them around the edges of all platforms." This was not a joke. The crystalline species did not understand humor. Han rubbed her primary eyes and tried to think of a better approach. A hive speaker stood up. There were an insect-like species that operated as a collective consciousness. "We do not understand why this is a problem. Our species cannot fall. We have perfect spatial awareness at all times. Railings would serve no purpose for us." "But other species can fall," Han said. "Then those species should be more careful." The ambassador was being careful. He did not know the edge was there because there was nothing to mark it. "Then those species should develop better awareness." Han felt a headache forming behind her eyes. She had not had a headache in 200 years. She was remembering why. The human ambassador raised her hand. Her name was Helena, and she had been watching the discussion with an expression that Han could not read. Human faces were strange and difficult to interpret. "May I speak?" Ambassador asked. Han nodded. At this point, she was willing to try anything. Ambassador stood up. She was a small being by galactic standards, with dark brown skin and hair that she wore in long braids. She looked around the room at all the different species represented. Then she smiled. "My species has only been traveling among the stars for a short time," she said. "We know that we are young and inexperienced compared to most of you. We have much to learn. But there is one thing that we know very, very well." She paused. Everyone was watching her. "We know how to hurt ourselves while having fun." The room was silent. "On our," Ambassador continued, "we have spent thousands of years finding creative new ways to injure ourselves during recreational activities. We have developed extensive knowledge about what can go wrong when beings gather together to enjoy themselves. We have learned many lessons. Most of them were learned the hard way." She looked at Commissioner Han. "We would like to share what we have learned, not because we think we are better than you, but because we have made many, many mistakes, and we believe those mistakes have value. They taught us something important." "What did they teach you?" Han asked. Ambassador smiled again. "That fun should be safe, and that safety does not happen by accident. It must be designed. It must be planned. It must be expected. And it must be the responsibility of the organizers, not the guests." The room erupted into argument, but Han was no longer listening. She was looking at the human ambassador with new understanding. This was going to be interesting. Part 2. The arguments lasted for 3 months. Commissioner Han had expected some resistance to the proposed safety reforms. She had not expected the level of anger that erupted across the Universal Festival Authority. Species that had not agreed about anything in centuries suddenly found common ground in their opposition to what they called human interference. The crystalline hegemony sent a formal complaint within days of the first proposal. Their ambassador, a being of living crystal who resonated at frequencies that most species could not hear, appeared before the HFY Council to deliver their objections personally. Guardrails, the ambassador said, and the word came out like a discordant note, will obstruct our ability to absorb ambient radiation. The festival is one of the few events where we can fully nourish ourselves while enjoying the company of other species. Your proposed barriers will block the wavelengths we need to survive. Ambassador nodded thoughtfully. We can design barriers that allow those wavelengths through while still preventing falls. It is not the same. The barriers will still be there. We will still feel them. This is unacceptable. The collective had their own objections. Their hive speaker addressed the council with the calm certainty of a species that had never experienced individual doubt. "You're incapable of falling," the hive speaker said. "This is not opinion, this is biological fact. Our members have perfect spatial awareness at all times. Every individual knows exactly where every other individual is located. We cannot step backward without knowing what is behind us. The concept is meaningless to us. Therefore, these proposed railings are meaningless to us. They will cost resources to build and maintain. They will provide no benefit to our species. Why should we support them?" "Because other species can fall," Ambassador said. "That is their concern, not ours. With respect, we are all members of the same Universal Festival Authority. What harms one species harms us all." The hive speaker made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been disagreement. "We are connected to each other. You are not connected to us. Do not pretend that you understand our perspective." 3 ancient species threatened to withdraw from the HFY entirely. The owl, who had been attending festivals since before most member species had developed writing, sent a terse message declaring that they would not submit to the paranoid delusions of a species that had only achieved moments ago. The endless, whose name for themselves could not be translated into any known language, simply stopped responding to communications. The wandering, who existed as clouds of conscious gas, announced that they would drift to another part of the galaxy rather than deal with such nonsense. Ambassador did not give up. She requested time to address the full HFY Council. She spent 2 weeks preparing her presentation. When the day came, she stood before representatives of more than 800 species and began to talk about Earth. "My species has a long history of recreational activities," she said. "We have always enjoyed gathering together for fun. We have always found creative ways to entertain ourselves. And we have always found creative ways to get hurt while doing so." She showed them images from human history. Gladiatorial combat, where humans fought each other to the death for entertainment. Bull running, where humans raced through streets alongside angry animals that weighed 10 times as much as they did. Roller coasters, which were machines designed specifically to create the sensation of falling and nearly dying. Fireworks, which were explosive devices set off near large crowds of people. "In one of our ancient periods," she said, "we held parties where the primary entertainment was watching bears fight dogs. In a later period, we designed a playground for children that became known as the Widow Maker because of how many serious injuries it caused. We have a long tradition of finding new and exciting ways to hurt ourselves." She paused to let this sink in. "We are not proud of this history, but we have learned from it. Every injury, every death, every disaster has taught us something. We have spent centuries developing safety standards for human recreation. We know what works and what does not work. We know that beings will make poor decisions when they are excited. We know that emergency systems must function for beings who are panicking, not just for beings who are calm. We know that if something looks like it could be eaten or drunk, beings will try to eat or drink it regardless of whether it is actually food. She looked around the room. We understand danger. We do not fear fun. We simply believe that a good time should not require writing a will beforehand. The response was mixed. Some species seemed thoughtful, others seemed offended. The debate continued for weeks. The turning point came unexpectedly. The Festival of Ascending Flames had been celebrated on 7 for 8,000 years. It was a sacred event for the people. Young coated themselves in a special bioluminescent gel and ran through columns of controlled plasma fire. Those who completed the course were considered adults. Those who did not complete the course were mourned as heroes who had died trying. The festival had a mortality rate of 0.003% over its entire history. This meant that, on average, about 1 or 2 participants died each year. They considered this acceptable. It was part of the tradition. Death was part of life. A human safety inspector named was assigned to observe the festival as part of the ongoing HFY safety review. He was a quiet man with gray hair and careful eyes. He had spent 30 years working on safety systems for human spacecraft before retiring and joining the diplomatic corps. He watched them prepare for their festival with professional interest. He asked to walk the course before the event began. They were surprised by this request, but they allowed it. They watched as the human walked slowly through the columns of dormant plasma fire, taking notes on a small device. He measured distances. He examined the gel application stations. He tested the emergency response systems. When he finished, he asked to speak with the High Priestess. The High Priestess was an elderly with faded scales and wise eyes. She had overseen the festival for 60 years. She had watched many young complete the course. She had also watched many young die. "I have 3 suggestions," said. "They are small changes. They will not alter the nature of your festival, but I believe they will save lives." The High Priestess listened. The first suggestion was a gel thickness testing station. The bioluminescent gel protected participants from the plasma fire, but only if it was applied thickly enough. Currently, participants applied their own gel without any verification. Suggested that a simple testing station could confirm that everyone had adequate protection before they began the course. The second suggestion was a redundant fire suppression system. The current system was designed to shut down the plasma columns if something went wrong, but it relied on a single control mechanism. If that mechanism failed, there was no backup. Suggested adding a second, independent system that could activate automatically. The third suggestion was the most controversial. Wanted to teach participants something that humans called stop, drop, and roll. If their gel coating failed and they caught fire, they should stop running, drop to the ground, and roll to extinguish the flames. This simple technique had saved countless human lives over the centuries. The High Priestess was quiet for a long time after finished speaking. "We have always believed," she said finally, "that those who die in the flames are meant to die, that their death is part of the sacred cycle, that we should not interfere with fate." Nodded, "I understand, but I have a question." "Ask it." "Do you believe that the young who die in your festival want to die?" The High Priestess did not answer. "Do their families want them to die? Do their friends? Do the other participants who witness their deaths?" Still no answer. "I am not asking you to change your traditions," said gently. "I am asking you to consider whether death must be part of them. I am asking whether there might be a version of this festival that is just as meaningful, just as sacred, but where everyone goes home at the end." The High Priestess looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave orders to implement all 3 suggestions. That year, for the first time in 8,000 years of recorded history, 0 participants died at the Festival of Ascending Flames. The high priestess wept when she received the news. Her tears were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of grief for something she had never allowed herself to feel. "We always told ourselves that some deaths were acceptable," she said. "We told ourselves it was tradition. We told ourselves it was fate. We never asked if it could be different." She looked at with ancient eyes. "We never asked." The news spread across the galaxy within days. The Festival of Ascending Flames, one of the most dangerous traditional events in known space, had achieved 0 fatalities for the first time in its history. The changes that made this possible had been suggested by a human. The debate within the UFA shifted overnight. Species that had opposed the safety reforms began to reconsider. Species that had been undecided began to voice support. The arguments continued, but the momentum had changed. Ambassador smiled when she heard the news. She had been waiting for something like this. She had known that arguments alone would not be enough. She had known that someone somewhere would need to see the difference with their own eyes. Now they had. The real work could finally begin. Part 3. 50 years passed. The Universal Festival Authority published its comprehensive safety guidelines on the anniversary of the reforms, as they had come to be known. The document was 16 million words long in its base language. It had been translated into over 4,000 languages and adapted for species that communicated through smell, touch, light, or magnetic fields. It included contributions from 847 different species. Commissioner Han had retired long ago, but she attended the publication ceremony as an honored guest. She sat in the front row and watched as the current commissioner unveiled the final document. She had not expected to live long enough to see this day. She was very glad that she had. The guidelines were built around 4 core principles. These principles had seemed absurdly obvious to humans when they were first proposed. They had seemed strange and unnecessary to most other species. Now, after 50 years of debate and implementation and adjustment, they had become accepted wisdom across the galaxy. The first principle stated that all recreational activities should assume participants would make poor decisions while excited. This meant that safety systems should be designed for beings who were not thinking clearly. It meant that dangerous areas should be marked in ways that were obvious even to beings who were distracted or impaired. It meant that instructions should be simple enough to follow without conscious thought. The second principle stated that emergency systems should function for individuals experiencing panic, impairment, or sensory overload. This meant no more meditation-based teleportation beacons. It meant alarms that could be triggered by instinct rather than careful action. It meant rescue systems that could find and save beings who were too frightened to help themselves. The third principle stated that if something looked like it could be consumed, it should either be consumable or clearly marked as otherwise. This seemed obvious, but it had required extensive work to implement. Different species had very different ideas about what looked consumable. Containers had to be redesigned from the ground up, with shapes and textures that were universally recognized as not food. The process had taken 15 years, but the result was worth it. The fourth principle was the most important. It stated simply, never underestimate a sentient being's ability to find new and creative ways to hurt themselves. This principle was posted in every UFA facility. It was quoted at the beginning of every safety meeting. It became a kind of unofficial motto for the entire organization. It reminded everyone that safety was not a problem that could be solved once and forgotten. It was an ongoing process that required constant attention and constant creativity. The document became known across the galaxy as the Fun Should Be Safe Accords. It changed everything. Attendance at galactic festivals increased by 340% in the first decade after implementation. Species that had previously avoided interstellar celebrations began to participate for the first time. Parents who had never taken their children to off-world events now felt comfortable doing so. The elderly attended festivals they had assumed were beyond their ability to safely enjoy. Individuals with disabilities found that events were now designed to accommodate their needs rather than ignore them. One image from this period became famous across the galactic networks. A photographer captured a hive drone gripping a guardrail with obvious satisfaction. The species, as they had loudly proclaimed for years, was physically incapable of falling. Their perfect spatial awareness made railings completely unnecessary for them. But the drone in the photograph was holding the railing anyway, running its appendages along the smooth surface with what looked very much like pleasure. When asked about this image, a hive speaker gave an unexpected answer. "We cannot fall," the hive speaker admitted, "but we can touch. We can feel the railing beneath our limbs. We can know that it is there, that someone put it there, that someone cared enough about our safety to build it even though we did not need it. This feeling is pleasant. We did not expect this." The image was shared billions of times across the galactic networks. It became a symbol of the reforms and their unexpected benefits. Sophie, the child who had saved Ambassador at the festival, grew up to become Dr. Sophie. She studied at the most prestigious universities on Earth and then continued her education at institutions across the galaxy. She wrote papers on cross-species risk perception. She developed new methods for identifying hazards that were obvious to some species but invisible to others. She became the foremost expert in her field. When the HFY created the position of Human Safety Liaison, she was the obvious choice. On the 50th anniversary of the reforms, she gave a speech that was broadcast to every inhabited system in the galaxy. Trillions of beings watched as she stood at a podium on the same platform where she had once grabbed an ambassador before he could fall to his death. The platform now had railings. It had emergency beacons that activated with a single touch. It had color-coded zones showing safe areas and restricted areas. It had attendants stationed at regular intervals, ready to help anyone who needed assistance. Doctor looked out at the audience. She saw beings of every shape and size and composition. She saw old rivals who had once opposed the reforms now sitting beside their strongest supporters. She saw young beings who had never known a galaxy without safety standards, who could not imagine festivals that did not protect their participants. "Humans did not invent safety," she said. "Every species has some concept of protecting their members from harm. Every species cares about survival. But humans did invent something important. We invented the expectation of survival." She paused to let this sink in. For most of galactic history, recreational activities have been understood as inherently dangerous. If you wanted to have fun, you accepted certain risks. Some of those risks included death. This was considered normal. It was considered acceptable. It was considered part of the experience. She shook her head slowly. Humans rejected this idea, not because we are cowards, not because we fear death, but because we believe that fun should not require sacrifice. We believe that every being who attends a festival should go home at the end of it. We believe that memories should be the only souvenirs from a good time. She looked at the platform beneath her feet, at the guardrails that had once seemed so controversial. Other species accepted that sometimes beings die doing things they love. We decided that was unacceptable, not because death is always preventable, not because risk can ever be completely eliminated, but because we should try. We should always try. We should design our celebrations around the assumption that everyone deserves to survive them. She smiled. It was the same smile she had given Ambassador 50 years ago, when she was 8 years old and wondering why grown-ups were so strange. Fun should be safe. It seems obvious now, but the best ideas always do eventually. The audience applauded. The sound traveled across the platform, across the gathering, across the system, across the galaxy. It was a sound of agreement and gratitude and hard-won understanding. The festival that year had record attendance. Beings from species that had never participated before came to see the dying star paint the void in colors they could not fully perceive. They stood on platforms with railings and emergency beacons, and clearly marked safety zones. They drank fire wine from containers that could never be mistaken for cleaning solvents. They took selfies without risking their lives. At the end of the festival, the organizing committee announced the statistics: record attendance, record satisfaction ratings, and for the 73rd consecutive year since the reforms, 0 fatalities. Commissioner Han, watching from her seat of honor, felt tears forming in 3 of her 7 eyes. She was old now, older than she had ever expected to be. She had lived long enough to see the galaxy change. She had lived long enough to see ideas that once seemed impossible become ordinary. She thought about the human child who had grabbed Ambassador before he could fall. She thought about the question that child had asked, the question that had started everything. Why don't you have a fence? Such a simple question, such an obvious question, and yet no one had ever asked it before. That was the human gift, Han realized. Not courage, not technology, not even their safety expertise. It was their willingness to ask obvious questions that everyone else had learned not to ask. It was their refusal to accept that things had to be the way they had always been. The galaxy had learned something important from humanity. It had learned that traditions could be changed. It had learned that acceptable losses did not have to be accepted. It had learned that the question why was always worth asking, even when the answer seemed obvious. Especially when the answer seemed obvious. Doctor finished her speech and stepped away from the podium. The audience continued to applaud. The dying star continued to release bursts of beautiful light. The platforms continued to float safely in the void, their passengers protected by railings and beacons and the accumulated wisdom of 50 years of work. In the end, the galaxy had learned what humanity had always known. Nothing ruins a party quite like someone dying at it. And everyone, regardless of species or origin or biology, deserves to wake up the next morning with stories to tell and memories to treasure. Perhaps with a bit of a headache, perhaps with some regrets about their dance moves, perhaps with the happy exhaustion that comes from celebrating too hard. But fundamentally, wonderfully, undeniably alive.